Hi. All right, I'm back. Um, God damn it, Vigo. He turned off the camera last take. So, um, I usually love him. He's my co-star, really. But the fact that he keeps jumping on the computer does make this a little difficult. Anyway, I would like to talk about the Numenera system today. Um, the way I run it and the way you might like to run it in a game you campaign or even just suggest to your local DM. So Numenera, I think it's important to first talk about the guy who wrote it, Monty Cook. He, for those who don't know, he wrote D&D 3E. He did a lot of the work for that system, and he's arguably one of the fathers of D&D. He has a few other things under his belt, but that Dungeons and Dragons is the main thing. He wrote his own system a while back off of Kickstarter called Numenera. It's technically part of a larger system called the Cipher system, but the semantics don't really matter. The Numenera system is cool mostly because of its setting, in my opinion, and because it's like very simple. I wouldn't quite go so far as to call it elegant because it kind of has its flaws, but it is very easy to run. So the setting for Numenera is the Ninth World, which is Earth a billion years or so into the future. And those of you who are into astronomy would know that that's kind of pushing it with terms of the sun expanding and aging. But one of the interesting things in the Numenera system is that the sun hasn't burned the Earth to a crisp yet. And that's one of its many mysteries. The deal is, the reason it's called the Ninth World is because there have been 8, at least, previous major civilizations that have risen and collapsed since our time. And the people who live in the Ninth World are this kind of almost Bronze Age, very relatively primitive human society, kind of picking over the wreckage of all these alien, interdimensional, sometimes human, sometimes not, massive sci-fi civilizations. So it's kind of this mix between fantasy and sci-fi, where a lot of the fantasy elements, like magic, monsters, that sort of thing, come from science fiction. That's not totally new. There's elements of that, honestly, in the source for wand stones. No, buddy. In the Tales from Dying Earth. Here, I'll move it back so he can be in the shot without turning the camera off. Okay, there we go. Is your stardom, your thirst for attention satiated, buddy? Okay. Right, so, the Numenera system. What's interesting about it is it doesn't have the normal 6 stats of Dungeons and Dragons, strength, constitution, dexterity, wisdom, intelligence, charisma. Instead, it just has speed, intellect, and might. So speed kind of encompasses dexterity and to an extent wisdom, like kind of intuition type stuff. Might is strength and constitution rolled into one, and intellect is like intelligence and kind of charisma rolled into one. So the way it works for social interactions is a little limited. Before the major expansion that was produced in a new Kickstarter, which includes Numenera Destiny, as well as Numenera Discovery, which is what they rebranded the first edition rulebook, which kind of includes rules for like influencing people and building communities and engineering things and being sort of a ranger, like a professional salvager, which is interesting in its own right. The rule system is cool, but it's only really for longer campaigns, that second book. For the most part, you can do with like just the standard Numenera core book that was released quite a while ago. So the gist of the system is that the players perform all the roles. That's kind of its hook. And all of the roles are based off of these difficulty levels, right? The way you get the DC, the score you have to roll over for a given difficulty level is take the difficulty level and multiply by 3. So for a difficulty level 1, you have to roll 3 or above on a d20. For difficulty level 2, you have to roll 6 or above, etc. The way that works for players is the DM will say, hey, give me a difficulty 3 speed check. If they make it, then the DM describes how they avoid an attack. If they fail it, then the DM describes how they get hit. It's kind of a cool system that keeps players a little more involved during combat, because in practice in D&D, the DM's rolling around half the dice. And certainly spends a lot more time describing things than the players do. And Numenera kind of makes an effort to put a little bit more of that back in the hands of the players, which is good. Both because the DM honestly has enough on their plate, and because, it keeps people involved. So that's cool. One of the major flaws of the system, in my opinion, is that it can be kind of easy to get OP. A lot of the powers are very powerful, and you start out fairly powerful. First level, with the original trinity of classes, Jack, Glaive, and Nano, which are basically Rogue, Warrior, and Wizard, are all very powerful in their own right. You start out fairly powerful. And you only get more so, one of the higher tiered Nano spells is literally move mountains. Just to give you an idea, Monty Cook is infamous for having quadratic wizards in linear fighters, where wizards get far more powerful, far more quickly than fighters do, even though they start out a little bit less powerful than fighters. So there are arguably some balances against that in the Numenera system, namely the fact that when you cast spells, it essentially drains from your life pool. So you have pools for speed, intellect, and might, and when you drain one of them to 0, that's kind of the equivalent of being crippled or debilitated or put on death's door, whatever you like. It's bad. But it's also, those pools are also a numerical resource you spend to make rolls easier. And so the thing is usually damage rolls will take more from the pool than if you spend 3 or even 6 to make a dice roll easier. The way it works is you can spend usually 3 points from a pool to bring a check down 1 difficulty level, meaning you essentially add 3 to your roll functionally. So it's interesting in that you kind of have this short-term expenditure of your health to prevent future loss of health. It's this really interesting risk-reward system, and it's kind of cool. I like it for the most part. In fact, I've been running a Numenera game for around 1.5 years now. It's mostly why I want to talk about it. I kind of want to seg that into talking about how you do a to be continued effectively when the party's split, which I know is a cardinal rule of the role-playing games community. Don't split the party. And it's definitely true that when the party's together, it's both easier for them and easier for the DM to describe everything. The sessions tend to move a lot faster in terms of in-game events, and everything tends to be smoother. On the other hand, though, if you really impress upon your players that it's an open world, more often than not, they'll want to do their own thing. So one possible way around that is to kind of insist that they find a compromise. Okay, we'll go to the electric swamps today, but tomorrow we better go investigate that haunted library. Oh, Vigo, you okay? I think he has allergies. Dumbass cat. All right. Anyway, so that's a valid strategy for sure. But what I did, at least for the first part of my Numenera game, was I let the players kind of go off, do their own thing. It resulted in them at some points being in different dimensions to each other, different planets, which is fine because I tend to fly by the seat of my pants anyway with only a map and a description of each area. And maybe competing factions, what each of them want. So that actually worked out fine, except that over the course of an entire year of role-playing, once a week, we got maybe 3 days into the story, which is not great. On the other hand, though, those 3 days were really packed with different events and branching storylines. So, pros and cons. Anyway, I think the Numenera system kind of gives itself to this just because of how eclectic it is and how much it streamlines and sort of simplifies a lot of combat and exploration checks. It's also worth noting that you don't get XP from combat necessarily in Numenera. You get XP from discovery, at least in the rules as written. It's more about exploring the strange environment of the Ninth World. And discovering things. And you can discover something like vague and metaphorical, like the corruption of a local government. That would count towards XP too. But for the most part, I think what it encourages is exploring like a rusted out hulk of a gigantic interdimensional crab that uses skyscrapers as its shell. That's, I think, the goal of the Numenera system. And so I think it does give itself to this sort of split party play. And when you play like that, I think it's necessary to find good breaking points to switch from person to person. The way I ended up doing it, the way that might work for any potential Numenera DMs, is by doing a sort of paperback novel. Hi, buddy. To be continued. So anyone who's read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure will know the iconic to be continued label that's put at the end of each episode. Similar to that, like Pulp Fiction, Penny Dreadfuls, a lot of the serial pieces of literature written in the 1800s and early 20th century and stuff are all like very much of that to be continued, leave on a cliffhanger sort of vibe. In fact, Oliver Twist was originally written like that. So it's definitely effective in terms of maintaining attention. Although, again, when you split the party, you end up with having almost everyone being a peanut gallery to what one or two people are doing, which is fun in terms of like commentary and just dicking around with friends. But it can kind of take away from the internal consistency of the game and like the seriousness, getting in character sort of thing, which is something you might want to watch out for if that's something you value as a DM. So, where to put these breaks, right? When you switch between characters, where to put the to be continued? It's hard, right? It's something you kind of just have to get an intuitive feel for. So maybe to an extent, this video is a little useless. If my advice is just, oh wow, you'll need to figure it out, that's not super useful. I do have a few pointers though, in that you might want to continue when put a to be continued when the player character is either in danger or waiting a major response either from an environment or an NPC. Or one thing that's very effective is you swing open the door and you see to be continued. It's a bit of a dick move, just leaving your players on the hook like that, but it does help maintain interest. It also, honestly, gives you time to draft up what's coming next in the back of your head, especially if you're having players go into different directions that you haven't really planned for yet. A lot of it kind of comes down to improv, and that's definitely just the sort of thing you improve over time. Especially in the context of role-playing games, where it's not just improv, not just coming up with a character who has enjoyable quirks or who feels real, but it's also improving sort of a whole setting, which is difficult. It means you have to have a very singular vision for what the setting is. Now that's kind of easy for Numenera because it has a very particular oeuvre. In the rulebook, it describes it as the weird, which is essentially the very surreal, the very alien juxtaposed with the very mundane. It's a little bit like Lynchian. David Lynch is weird, but the whole Lynchian as a descriptive term is pretty close to how Numenera describes the weird. It's a whole thing in and of itself, but if you are using the default Numenera setting, then you're kind of in luck in that improving a whole setting can be easy if you get a feel for the vibe of Numenera, because it's almost more about the atmosphere than the particulars of a location. One of the major themes of it, given that a billion years has passed, is that sort of time consumes all. and that a billion years is so very long, allowed for so much piling of events upon events upon events, and disasters upon disasters upon disasters, and weird sci-fi civilization upon weird sci-fi civilization. You get the idea. That you can almost put anything in there and it will make sense. It should have its own internal consistency. Like, it should ideally give a vibe that to some advanced alien race, the device or setting you're exploring makes perfect sense. Maybe it's been warped by the passage of time, but it at one point had a purpose. That purpose can be absolutely bizarre. And for inspiration for that, I actually kind of recommend going to anthropology texts. That might sound a little weird, but the fact of the matter is that human culture is often more diverse and, from a Western perspective, strange than we give it credit for. Um, just being normal Homo sapiens living on Earth without any bizarre sci-fi technology or mandates, our cultures vary a whole lot. One of the best examples that comes to mind is the South American tribe that comes out and literally dances with the dead. The men get drunk, remove the rocks in front of the sepulchres, and bring out the often still decaying corpses of their forebears. They have the women dance with the men and the men dance with the women. There's often a lot of vomiting and a lot of crying, understandably. People don't like it, but it's still done just to sort of fulfill this social contract that when you die, it doesn't mean you're out of the community. So for most people, from a Judeo-Christian Western perspective, that will seem very bizarre and alien, and like, why in the world would you want to see your rotting grandpa up close, let alone hold them so close to you that you can actually smell the decay? I apologize, by the way, this is getting a little gross, but the point is that if that is how different human cultures can be, if that's how much variation can happen over only a few thousand years of us developing agriculture and kind of the free time to develop customs, you can only imagine what alien civilizations would get up to over the course of millions of years, or human civilizations, with the complexity of stuff like the internet, even the amount of subcultures that have emerged there. So, okay, I realize that's all very long-winded, but the point I'm trying to make here is that there should be the impression that the structures you're describing made sense to their creators, even if that sense is very foreign and alien to the perspective of people living in the ninth world, or even to people living today. You can kind of cheat in that you can use scientific principles you read about, particularly like cutting edge stuff, and use that as a jumping off point, right? So, for example, there has been discussion about using bacteria to kind of break down plastics and make them into oil. Now, it's not that far-fetched to sort of have an invisible swarm of bacteria that digests all things plastic and turns them into oil, even stuff on players' persons. So, wandering into a strange broken down structure could result in people getting absolutely everything on their person that might be made of some kind of hydrocarbon melted into oil and seeping down their clothes as some sort of still functioning automata come to collect up the oil. That, in my opinion, is pretty strange and an interesting hook for an adventure. You might want to figure out where those automata are going, what the source of the melting is. It could result in a whole investigation of things that Ninth Worlders wouldn't really understand. You kind of have to trust your players too to like suspend their disbelief and suspend their knowledge of current science to sort of help with the alienness of a lot of these things. You can also definitely go into the realm of softer sci-fi with more straight up magic, and that helps too. So, what are the takeaways? The Numenera system is super light and good for running a specific type of game. And also, if you decide to run a game with a split party and a massive open world with players going every which way, you might want to set out almost a universe Bible for yourself and kind of just get an idea for the tone of the structures you want to describe instead of the specifics. You can fill in the details later and make the challenge appropriate for the players. Yeah, there are a lot. I have a lot to say on the Numenera system, but I think I'll stop here. It's been around 20 minutes, and I think that's enough for one video. Yeah, have a good day. There you go, you dumbass cat. Let me pause the video.